talk about today is the Cook Political Report's LSU Manship School midterm election poll that was released late last week. You can find the poll either by going to the Cook Political Report's website or to the Manship School's website. I kind of want to talk about a few different topics today. First, I kind of want to talk a little bit overall about what our poll says in terms of the top lines and really relate that back to the conditions of this year's midterm elections nationally, and particularly in the battleground districts for the United States House of Representatives. Then I want to come back and talk about the role of the president in these midterm election cycle. And then I'll talk a little bit about the issues that people are paying attention to and care about in this election cycle. And then I'm going to end with talking a little bit about interest and engagement, because fundamentally that will drive what we see happen in 8 days. So first of all, the poll itself was a really exciting project to work on. We partnered with the Cook Political Report, whom, as most of you know, are the brand in DC when it comes to handicapping and tracking congressional elections, U.S. Senate elections, gubernatorial elections. Charlie Cook, who is a big part of the Cook Political Report, has connections to LSU and the Manship School, and he's been a big supporter of us, and it was great to have an opportunity to work with him directly as well as other folks at the Cook Political Report to develop this survey. What made our survey interesting and unique is we're one of just a handful of places that were really diving into the battleground districts, the districts that are ultimately going to decide which party is in control of the U.S. House of Representatives come next year. And so to do that, it's a national survey, but we oversampled. That is, we spent a lot of extra time gathering respondents in the battleground districts for the U.S. House, the 72 districts that fall under the categories of a toss-up district or a district that leans Democratic or leans Republican, according to the Cook Political Report ratings. So we're able to speak to what's happening in those battleground districts as compared to what's happening in the rest of the country in different kinds of districts that are safer for one part or the other. The other thing that was really neat about this particular poll is we were able to take some questions, because of the way we administered the survey, we were able to take some questions and link back and repeat from a similar poll that I had worked on back in 2010, as you know, the first midterm cycle under the presidency of Barack Obama, and adjust them here or there to reference the name of the president and see how the mood in 2018 compares or contrasts with the mood in 2010, which, as you know, is a pretty significant midterm election year. So that was sort of the idea behind the project, and we have a lot of really interesting findings, but I actually want to start off in an unconventional way by talking about the least interesting finding. It's the one that a lot of people pay attention to. I think this is just human nature. It's certainly the way we talk about politics, but fundamentally it's actually the least, I would say it's interesting, but it's the least valuable thing that our poll offers, and that's just the top line result. The top line result, who's winning, who's losing on the generic ballot. It's the number everybody pays attention to, but there's 30 polls you can look back at over the last few weeks that are tracking the generic ballots. Maybe not always in the battleground, although there are one or two other polls that are, but to me that's not the most interesting number. And so what we find is nationally among registered voters, Democrats have about a 7-point lead on the generic ballot, which is very much in line with what you'll see and sort of the aggregate and the average across polling for registered voters over the last few weeks. But in the battleground we have an estimate that's a little bit bigger than that. And I think that's gotten a lot of attention, like, oh my gosh, it's a double-digit lead in the battleground. Well, the number that you also need to pay attention to is the number in the report that comes right after that, plus or minus a margin of error of 9 points. That's a significant margin of error. What does it mean? It actually speaks to exactly the state of this race right now. The Democrats have an advantage. We can say that. Can we say how big that advantage is or how likely it is to translate into a certain number of seats? No. And I think this is what a lot of the conversation, not just about this poll per se, but about the midterms, has lost. And frankly, it's an issue that's happened in 2016, in 2014, in 2012, happens all the time. It's an underappreciation for uncertainty. And what we're seeing in the midterms right now is that the Democrats have an advantage. They look like they have a good shot at taking the U.S. House. But there's enough uncertainty around those numbers that we really can't say a lot about how big of a lead they may have in the battleground or how many seats they may pick up. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So really the takeaway, the top line takeaway, and again, like I say, this is, to me, the least interesting part of the poll, is that it fits right with sort of what we can see when we evaluate the midterms this year. The Democrats seem to have an advantage. This seems to be a tough year for Republicans, but it is in no way an overwhelming advantage. in the U.S. House, and it is no way, or at least not in a way that we can identify precisely today. And it's uncertain. There's enough moving parts that it's not clear exactly what might happen. So this is how that stacks up. So I want to talk a little bit about why forecasters and pollsters and other people following politics see this as a year where the Republicans are having a little bit more struggles. And it's all the things you might expect, the things that sort of often add up to a good year for the out party. So first of all, across a lot of polls, including ours, the Democrats on the generic ballot nationally have anywhere from a 7 to 9 point advantage. That's a pretty good advantage. That's the kind of advantage they need to be in to have a real shot at flipping control of the U.S. House. So that's one thing that speaks to, okay, maybe the Democrats are having a pretty good year this year. The second is if you look at district by district polls, particularly in the last few weeks, in competitive races, many of them, not all, but many of them have trended a few points in the Democratic direction, so that's a good sign that they're competitive or starting to move a little bit in the Democratic direction. The latest fundraising numbers have had Democratic candidates looking a lot stronger than Republican candidates in these U.S. House races. And then if you want to back out before the campaign, the party that's seen the most retirements has been the Republican Party, and that's usually a sign that that party's going into a tougher midterm year. And if you look back over special elections over the last year and a half, they generally Democrats have overperformed in them, and so that's also the kind of predictor that suggests Democrats are in for a good year. How big of a good year, we don't necessarily know. It doesn't necessarily mean they will definitely win the House, but they certainly have an advantage. But the biggest advantage they have is that they have lots of opportunities to win the House, right? So there's 72 districts that are seen as leaning towards the Democrats or leaning towards the Republican or toss-ups. Democrats only need to win a net gain of 23 seats to flip control of the House. Of the 15 seats that are classified as leaning Democratic among these competitive seats, the Democrats have a pretty healthy lead in those. There's a good chance they'll win those 15. Now, they already have 2 of them. 13 of them are Republican seats. So they're going to pick 13 seats up there. There's a good chance there's a couple of seats in Minnesota that they currently have that they may lose. So they could net out of this about 13 seats just on the lean Democratic seats. They only need to net 10 more, and they've got 29 toss-up seats and 26 lean Republican seats to get that from, right? So there's 55 seats that the Democrats have a chance, and they just have to pick off 10 of them, of those remaining 55 competitive seats, and they win control of the U.S. House. It's those numbers. That's the reason we say Democrats look like they have an advantage. Republicans have to win 46 out of 55, and the Democrats have to win only 10 out of 55. If you're a Democrat, that's where you want to be. So why is it uncertain? Well, it's uncertain because there are some factors that do favor Republicans. Republicans tend to have higher participation in midterms, not every time, but often. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how there's somewhat mixed evidence about how well Democrats are doing on the enthusiasm factor. But the other thing is that this map, these competitive districts, they're in places that should be Republican-friendly districts, right? So it's not just like 55 random districts. They're 55 districts where Republicans have seen some success. Now, some of those districts are districts where Clinton won, even though a Republican is in Congress, but they're certainly not all that way. And so Democrats are going to have to win in places where Republicans have traditionally done better. So in that sense, it's sort of the opposite of the Senate map, right? Where in that sense, it's kind of similar to the Senate map that's Republican held areas that Democrats need to try to win. So that speaks to the things that are helping the Republicans. But again, the fact that the Democrats only need to net 10 wins out of those 55 toss-up or lean Republican districts after you factor out the 2 in Minnesota they're likely to lose, that's a pretty good shot. I mean, it's only 10 out of 55. That's not a bad place to be. So overall, this suggests that this is a midterm cycle where Democrats have an advantage. but it's not exactly clear how that advantage might translate to actual wins and losses once we go district by district. And that also speaks to the uncertainty, because it is sort of an interesting year, and these are a bunch of different moving parts. They don't just have to win one ballot, right? We're talking about 55 or 72, different district races, and while they will probably move together in a lot of ways, there's enough nuance across them that things could be different. So 2 examples of that is the Virginia 5th. So the Virginia 5th should be a Republican district, and I mean, it's held by a Republican, but it's kind of competitive. It's favoring the Republican right now. This is the district that contains Charlottesville, Virginia, but also contains a bunch of rural areas of Virginia. It's a big, sprawling district. And the Republicans should have like a healthy advantage there, but instead it's close, right? And so that speaks to like, well, look, the Democratic year is making a traditionally Republican district close. Then another example is the Florida, I believe it's the Florida 27th, which should be a Democratic district. Clinton carried that district by 16 points. And the Democrats will probably win it, but it's close. The Republicans keeping it close there in a blue year, right? And that probably has to do with the particularities of the candidate, some demographic trends in that district. So there's enough nuance across these districts that we don't have a high degree of precision to say Democrats are ahead by this much exactly in the battleground and likely to gain this many seats. I think most of the forecasters are suggesting that by the end of the day, there's the highest likelihood that that Democrats will end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of upper 220s to mid 230s. But they're all saying there's so much uncertainty, the Democrats could gain a few seats but still fall short of winning a majority, or they could particularly get up into the 240s and 250s. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a Democratic advantage, and a lot of uncertainty. And that's the same thing that our poll says. So now we sort of dispense with that. Let me talk about what's interesting about our poll. Our poll really helps dig in onto a few different factors on what's on the minds of voters, and one of them is the president. And the president is very much on the minds of voters, especially in battleground districts, especially among Democrats. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%-ish of folks are saying that President Trump will be a factor in how they decide how to vote for the midterm. And then in the battleground districts, those people that are saying this, almost 2/3 of folks that are saying this, they split 2-to-1 to saying, my vote will be in part to show opposition to the president. And only 1 out of 3 saying, my vote will be in part to show support for the president. President Trump, so the issue with Trump in this particular midterms, it's not that Republicans in the battleground don't like President Trump. He's still overall positive, net positive among Republicans, but here's the 2 key things. He's less positive, he's seen less positively among Republicans in the battleground than Republicans elsewhere. So he's doing a little bit worse in the battleground than elsewhere. And the other kick is that Republicans in the battleground seem less interested in connecting their support for the president to their midterm vote. So that's 2 ways that president's if you look at the popularity of the president among Republicans generally, he's doing pretty good. But there's 2 ways that slips once you're talking about Republican voters in the battleground. On the other side, Democrats and Democrat voters in the battleground very much have the president on their mind, and they're very much connecting that to their vote and how they intend to vote in the midterm. So he's something of a drag on Republican candidates in the battleground and a driving force among Democratic voters in the battleground. Another interesting thing about the role of the president is we were able to look back, we asked people how they felt about the presidency. Do you feel anger, frustration, helpless, hopeful, excited, proud? And we compared that to 2010. And it's what you might guess. It's the same, but in the opposite way. So 49% of Americans are frustrated with the Trump presidency today. In 2010, asked the same question to Americans about the Obama presidency, and guess what the result was? 49% of Americans were frustrated with the Obama presidency. Of course, it's not the same 49%, right? It's flipped, right? So in 2010, 70% of Republicans were frustrated with the Obama presidency. Very few Democrats were. Today, 70% of Democrats are frustrated with the Trump presidency, and very few Republicans are. So we flipped. Today, as you might guess, Republicans are excited and proud. In fact, I'll say this, they have higher levels of excitement and pride about the Trump presidency than Democrats did about the Obama presidency 8 years ago. Democrats are more angry now than they were, of course, under the Obama presidency in 2010. But what's interesting is they're even more angry than Republicans were in 2010. So we're actually seeing sort of this increasing polarization in how people feel about the presidency. So the directions, right? The out party is more negative, the in party is more positive. That's the same, but it's sort of more, it's getting more extreme. So next I'd like to talk just a little bit about issues that are on the voters' mind. And you may have heard that healthcare and the economy are big ones, and they are. Healthcare and the economy top the list of voters' concerns, issue concerns in this election. It differs a little bit by party. Democrats say healthcare is the most important issue, or rate it the most important, and Republicans rate the economy as the most important. It's interesting, though, is if you go map that back onto sort of what the campaigns are doing in terms of ads, there's a lot of ads about healthcare. Not as many ads about the economy. I mean, it's there, but it's not as much as there are ads about healthcare. So it makes me a little curious about the strategic decisions on what issues these candidates are trying to play to. Issues that are often considered hot button issues. Now remember, this poll was done in sort of early to mid-October, so things could change day by day. But guns were not a particularly big issue. Compared to relative to other issues, maybe that will change after the events of this weekend and last week. Immigration ranked relatively, it wasn't low, but it was relatively low compared to things like the economy, jobs, healthcare. We certainly see the president double downing on immigration as an issue, so we'll see if that moves that at all, or if it's perhaps just wasted effort if it's not doesn't have traction on terms of what people care about. So issues like in trade is not rated as relatively as all that high. So these issues we've seen in the news a lot over the past year just aren't high on the voters' agenda. So it's interesting to see how that maps onto what candidates are talking about. And then I want to come back and just talk a little bit about interest and enthusiasm. Because again, here you get sort of, there's a lot of evidence that suggests it's good for Democrats, but then there's just a little bit over here that says, well, let's not get carried away. You know, this may not be a blue wave after all. So Democrats have seen a significant increase in their enthusiasm, particularly towards since 2010. Democrats are express more interest in following the campaign than Republicans do. That was the opposite in 2010. Republicans had an interest and engagement advantage. Democrats now do this year, just in terms of talking about how interested they are in the elections and the campaigns. In fact, Republicans are kind of near where they were in 2010. Maybe a slight dip, but not a big change. And Democrats have seen a tremendous growth in their interest relative to 2010. I believe in 2010 it was something like 40% of Democrats were saying they had a lot of interest in following the campaign, or quite a bit of interest, and now it's up to the high 50s. So that's a significant increase for Democrats. The other sign that Democrats are particularly engaged is we asked people if they had engaged in a variety of political activities besides voting over the past year. Things like attending a campaign event, volunteering for a campaign, donating to a campaign, signing or circulating a petition, attending a protest, being a member of any organization that was involved in politics besides a political party, these kinds of things, contacting an elected official. And almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, Democrats are more active than Republicans in the past year. So that's a sign that Democrats are more engaged, more primed, more ready to go. But then the caveat. Democrats' likelihood of voting is higher than in 2010, but it's about even in our poll with Republicans. So I suppose you could look at that as half full or half empty. Usually Democrats lag behind Republicans in midterms, so maybe closing that gap is a success. But is it a success enough to translate their advantage in the landscape to votes and outcomes in elections? That part we don't know yet, because, like I said, they're about even in terms of their intention to show up and participate in this election. So those are some of the highlights I wanted to make. I think this poll has a strong contribution in those latter few topics I've discussed. It's really giving a sense, not just like who people are going to vote for. There's a bunch of polls that do that. But being able to actually look deeper than that, to look at sort of what's on the minds of voters, how does this speak to what's been on the minds of voters in the past? that is a valuable enterprise that we just didn't have access to until we did our poll to sort of fill in that gap. And so it's really that rich detail of what underlies this political landscape that I think is the most valuable contribution to that this survey makes. It's the Cook Political Report / LSU Manship School midterm poll. You can find it either at the Cook Political Report's website or at the Manship School's website. There's even more information in there. There's information about what kind of confidence people have in the integrity of our elections. There's information on what qualities they want in their political leaders and whether or not they think they're getting them. Lots of rich information in there, lots of detail that I would encourage you to take a look at. I'd be happy to take any questions along those lines. I'm happy to take any questions about the midterms in Louisiana, to the extent that they exist. And but I would want to finally say that today and tomorrow, the Louisiana State University is putting on its President's Symposium Behind the Ballot, which is this really great series of panels and speakers over 2 days, really deep delving into elections and American elections today. They've got topics for everybody: social media in elections, advertising in the elections, election integrity, cyber security in elections. Some highlights I'll point out is there's a Secretary of State forum tonight. This whole event is open to the public. I encourage you to attend. Some other potential highlights is that may be of interest to this crowd. There is a panel tomorrow on the role of media in elections and how well the media does their job in covering elections. It'll include a lot of local media personalities as well as Amy Berton from the Washington Post, and our Dean Martin Johnson will be there as well. And then finally, tomorrow evening, we're going to have one of the guests will be from the New York Times, James Dow, who was involved in the decision to publish the anonymous column, and so he'll be there speaking about that decision and sort of the role of the press in our politics, reflecting on that. He's not going to reveal the sources. Sorry. Okay, so questions.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
When I came to America, when I came to LSU, when I was 19, says don't get sick in America. One of the questions in your survey and reporting and talk today was about healthcare. So, would you tell us more about the don't get sick in America?
I can't speak to so the question is, it's a question about, I suppose the healthcare system in the United States and how it relates to elections, but maybe just attitudes towards healthcare in the United States more generally. Our poll really only taps healthcare to the extent that it looks at how important it is as an issue. And like I said, it's an issue that's rated pretty highly. Americans think this is a big issue, particularly Democrats. That's really all that this particular poll can say. I can say that healthcare is one of, and perhaps the issue that's being mentioned the most in campaign ads this election cycle. What the content of that is, we've seen health. So what's interesting about healthcare politics is it's dynamic, and we've seen it flip. So it used to be in 2010, Democrats weren't talking about healthcare a whole lot in their congressional races, right? Because at the time, Obamacare was relatively unpopular. Well, now Democrats are talking about healthcare all the time, right? Pre-existing conditions, Medicaid expansion, all this stuff. So there is flux in terms of what people think about particular healthcare issues. I know attitudes towards like whether or not we should have things like single payer or universal coverage. That stuff has moved up and down over the years, often in relation to debates that are in Washington. So I can't really speak to what Americans think about the quality of their healthcare or how equitable the healthcare distribution system in the United States is, because I haven't measured it, but it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in. There is a lot of good polling on it, and so I'd encourage you to take a look at folks like the Kaiser Family Foundation, who track this and have tracked it for many years, where you could probably find some things that might speak more directly to your question. Again, I would encourage you to look at what these other folks have done, because my poll does not track costs of healthcare or who benefits economically from healthcare. What is going on with this thing?
How much money do you need to get good idea?
Mark.
We talked about Democrats and Republicans, but about voters out there are independent. Can you track them? Are they voting? Or
Yeah, so independent.
party affiliated?
Right. So we do have we track that. So independents are sort of kind of exactly what you would expect. Actually, this is a good sign. This is a good point, and it speaks back to the signs of why the Democrats have an advantage this year. So independents are between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how they think about the president, how they intend to vote, but they lean a little bit more in the direction that Democrats are. So that suggests that that's a good. If you're a Democratic candidate, that's what you want. That is so the reported likelihood of voting is lower for independents. So my guess is a lot of independents won't necessarily a lot of Americans won't participate in the midterms anyway. Even though the expectation is turnout will be particularly high for a midterm this year, there'll still be many midterm. I mean, I bet turnout in this room will be super high, right? But across America as a whole, it's not going to be. It'll be higher than typical, but midterms are still relatively low. And independents will be among the least likely partisan group, to the extent you can call them a partisan group to vote. So lean towards the Democrats, but will they turn out and vote? And again, this goes back to the idea that there's some advantages for Democrats, but there's also some uncertainty, right? We can't go in and say anybody that comes up here and says it's a blue wave, and I know it's a blue wave, I think they're just misreading the data. I'm not saying that there won't be a blue wave. I'm just saying the data is not telling us in a clear, precise way that that's what's going to happen. And I think this point about independence kind of speaks to that. That yeah, they're leaning in a Democratic direction, but they're also don't seem as mobilized. Yes, ma'am.
Are there numbers that are showing that more people are early voting this year than some other years?
There are. I don't even have my phone on me anymore. The question is, are there numbers that suggest there's more people early voting this year than in past elections? Not in this poll, but yes, the actual early voting data itself does indicate that early voting is up, and it's in some places it's up by a tremendous amount relative to 2016 or 2014. I mean, we're talking in states like Texas, where it's just like, I think it's well over 500,000 more early votes cast than in 2 or 4 years ago. I'm always a little bit skeptical about reading too much into early voting, particularly when people try to discern the tea leaves for early voting on what that means for how people are voting. They're not good at that. For turnout, it's a little bit better, but even there you have to be careful because it varies so much state by state. And what I mean is the propensity to early vote varies so much by state to state. And in some places where early voting hasn't been around for quite as long, we haven't quite hit equilibrium. So Louisiana's a great example of this. So for example, if you look at the presidential elections from 2008, 2012, 2016, the number of early voters went up across those elections. So you might be like, wow, in 2012, more people were engaged and enthusiastic than in 2008. 2016, even more people were engaged and enthusiastic than in 2008 because more people are voting early. No, the actual total turnout in Louisiana in those presidential elections was basically the same for all three. It's more people who were voting anyway are now deciding, hey, this early voting thing's pretty convenient. I'm going to go do this. So you're really trying to navigate two trends. There's the actual trend in terms of like how much of this increase in early voting is an expression of enthusiasm, some of which it is, but how much of it is just this sort of secular increase in early voting as more and more people become habitual early voters, and separating those two can be very difficult. Yes, sir.
On your polling, do you distinguish at all between male and females in your polls? And do you see anything in the movements this year versus previously in this area?
Yes. The question is, the question is essentially about gender differences in political attitudes in this election. And yes, we do break things out by that way as well. And it's very consistent what's in other polling from this midterm cycle. Women are, so there's always a gender gap, always. I mean, there's typically a gender gap in elections where women lean more Democratic than men. That seems to be expanding this year versus other years, and it particularly seems to be an issue among college-educated women. Now, in our data, once you try to focus on that in the battleground, you're really starting to parse things out. The sample sizes are getting small, but this idea that college-educated white women are moving more Democratic versus recent years, that does seem to be happening, and it's something that does seem to be helping Democrats, particularly in these competitive House races where a lot of them are suburban districts with more higher educated populations. Not all of them, but many of them are. Now, does that mean, are we seeing, what's the trend among white women without a college degree? We're not seeing the same patterns there. And what does it mean for men with or without a college degree, right? It's not the same patterns there. So there are interesting differences by gender, particularly by gender in education. How much of that is sort of this moment in time versus a long-term shift? I think we just have to wait a few more cycles before we know. Julie.
This is going to be kind of a long question. I think there's...
Great, I specialize in long answers.
I think there's been a lot of discussion in the media nationally. I certainly know in my newsroom about how to report on polls in general. I'm not talking about your poll right now, just polling in general. Even Dean Bakke last year, I think when he was at the WRKF luncheon, said if he had to do it over again, he wouldn't have put that ticker on the front of the New York Times website, right, that showed that Hillary had a better chance of winning. And I'm curious, and I'll also say the AP revised its policy for how it's treating polls. It will only report on polls in the context of a story about some larger something or other. It won't report on a standalone poll. So I actually am curious about how you think journalists should use polling, because I have to say at this point, I really don't want to write about polls at all in a story. I just don't know that that readers are sophisticated enough to understand. 2016 was like, I think my worst fears about reporting on polling come to life, which is, people are like, you told us Hillary was going to win and then she didn't win. It's like, I don't think people, I wonder how to use it best such that, we're not misleading people into thinking something's happening that's not.
Right. So the question is, what good are polls anyway, and why should we bother to cover them? Which is a fair question. I would point out that so I think I think there's a couple things going on here. First are the polls themselves. The polls, and I know people have a hard time believing this, but the polling error in 2016 wasn't really that off. In fact, the polls were more accurate in 2016 than 2012. The difference is when the error is in the direction of the winner, nobody talks about it afterwards. It doesn't matter if we sort of underestimated Barack Obama's vote and he won anyway, because nobody was saying that Romney was going to win based on the polls. But the polls were not off in 2016. Now, some state polls in key battleground states, or what states that turned out to be key battleground states but weren't necessarily thought of beforehand, we didn't have a lot of polls in those states, so we're relying on a few polls. The samples were the samples were fine. The errors were a little bit bigger because people weren't getting enough, particularly whites without college degrees turned out to be a little bit underrepresented in the weighting schemes that's done to election polls. And so the errors were a little bit bigger there, and it was enough that you had these close races. I know that's not particularly satisfying, but I do think the point that you're making that, to really convey polls in the way that I think they should be conveyed, it takes a lot of detail and nuance that may be beyond the patience or sophistication of the average reader, and I think that's a real concern. It's a concern of mine as well. I'm not sure exactly how to deal with it, but I think the issue with the New York Times thing and the forecast that the Upshot was doing, the little meter thing going up and down, that's a second issue laid on top of it, because that was the forecast built on top of polls and then returns as they came in. So to me, the fundamental problem, so there's definitely challenges in the polling industry. It's getting harder to poll. Accurate polls can be, the things you have to do to ensure accuracy are getting more and more expensive. So there's definitely challenges in the polling. I'm not trying to give pollsters a pass. There's challenges there. But the real complications happen when in the interpretation part of things. And I don't think pollsters do a very good job of conveying. And I think, unfortunately, it's because a lot of folks doing these public polls, I would like to think I'm not one of these people, but some people will come and just like they want to hit. They want their enterprise's name in the paper, right? And so they're going to talk about 12-point advantage in the battleground, right? They're not going to come and say 9-point margin of error, so we really don't know except that there's an advantage, but I'm not sure how big it is. That's less sexy to say that, right? But that's the truth. And so conveying the uncertainty, because you have to be careful, because sometimes when you talk about uncertainty, then people want to go the other way and go, well, then we don't really know anything from the poll. And it's like, no, we do, but there's a level of precision we don't necessarily have. So I think it's the conveying of that, and I think in the forecaster side, it was bringing that uncertainty from polls into their own forecasts, and then people just not understanding probabilities very well, and so they would see something as like a 70% chance of happening as like a sure thing. It's like, well, no, it's not. So it's sort of layers of interpretation that make it hard to do. I think that the changes to say that you shouldn't write a story about a poll are right. You shouldn't write a story about a poll. Whenever possible, there should be multiple polls used. That's not as easy to do when you're talking about issues, but it can sometimes be done. But tying it to other information and having a poll as a part of a story can be helpful, but just to have a story about a poll, and I think frankly the media has gotten a lot better about that since 2016. I don't see it that much this time around. I mean, folks like the Times and the Washington Post will do it because it's their in-house sponsored polls, so they'll do that. But I think they've gotten better about sort of making the poll the story, because it shouldn't be. You always want more polls rather than one when you have an opportunity to have that. And if you can fold it into a broader discussion of the topic, that's helpful. And then just try to be, I think pollsters need to be more transparent about how they do their polls and what those decisions mean and what the level of uncertainty is. And then reporters just have to find a way to convey that in a way that people will understand.
I mean, I think like I'm looking ahead to 2019, and I really have like had a discussion with my editors about how we're going to handle polling, because we're not the upshot or 538 or someone that's using a model that also is tracking a large number of polls. I mean, for the Louisiana governor's race, we're going to have a lot of polls, but it's one state. It's just a different situation, and I am, worried.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is trends, right? And so it's, again, this gets away from talking about the one poll, but like when you have multiple, and you're right, there's not going to be a ton of polls in the Louisiana governor's race. There weren't a ton last time. There won't be a ton this time. We tend to not have a lot of polls in Louisiana. My suspicion for that is not just it's partly because we have this odd year, and so people aren't polling anyway, and so the only people paying attention to Louisiana are people in Louisiana. But it's also, I think, and I mean, I've done some, looked at this a little bit, our primary setup is harder. When you have a lot more candidates on the ballot, it's hard to poll accurately, and so I think folks don't want to get into that if they don't have to. And we tend to have larger errors than for other state elections in our polling at that phase. I will say our polling in the runoff in 2015 was actually most of the polls are pretty good, especially those that do like live caller things and things like that. But yeah, we're not going to have a ton of polls. But then again, like if you go back to 2015, the polls were, I mean, I don't know if I stood here, but I was saying in September of 2015, like, these polls are ridiculous. I mean, Edwards might win, but he's not winning by double digits. And it's like, no, the polls are right and the fundamentals are off. So.
I mean, I also want to be clear, like, I'm not talking about people reporting on their own poll, like, the applicant does a poll before, obviously they should be. I'm talking about more like those of us who are reporting on outside polls, not your own polling results.
Yes, sir.
We have a jumble around here, and every legislative session is always talking about changing it. But if that were to happen, do you think that that would be a major change in the way we conduct polling, or how they would lead a change of dynamic as to how we go about polling? If we had not
So the question is, if we if we had sort of more traditional election system, so not our primary where everybody's on the ballot, everyone's together, and they go to runoff and nobody gets a majority. Only state in the country that has that. Washington and California are close, but they're not exactly the same. So if we had a more traditional system, would that make polling different? I would guess it might invite a little bit more polling, but probably not a lot more, because again, it gets back to like, maybe it would in our federal elections if we had a Senate race on the ballot, an open seat in the Senate race or something like that. But in our gubernatorial races, probably not often, again, because we're sort of off cycle. So it's not like someone that would be like, oh, I want to do a bunch of battleground U.S. Senate races. Oh, look, Louisiana, I'm going to throw them in. You're not doing that in 2019 because there's just not a lot of other folks having elections at that time. So we probably wouldn't get a lot more. So my guess is it probably wouldn't make a big. Now, on our federal, we can actually go back and look, though. Were there more polls in 2008 in Louisiana when we briefly flipped to that traditional system, and we had a U.S. Senate race in 2008? Were there more polls then than, say, in 2014 or 2002? So you go back and look and see. I don't know what the answer is to that, but now I'm really curious to find out.
Speaking of trends, what trends do you see lasting until the next election cycle? Do you see trends that are starting with women or gender differences that you think will last for the next election cycle?
Yeah, I don't know. So the question is, what are the trends that might continue beyond 2018 and into the future elections down the road? I mean, there is. So I think the ones that people are looking a lot at now are things like women, particularly college-educated women, becoming more democratic. Will that continue? I don't know. The Democrats doing better among college-educated individuals as a whole in 2016 than they had done in the past, and how they may do in 2018. The fact that so many of these Republican districts are competitive, even though they're suburban, sort of more highly educated, those are classic Republican districts. But now Democrats are having a chance there. I'm guessing that some of that stuff will sort of maybe flip back once Trump's worked his way through our moment in history, but I don't know. That's just a total hunch. Things like age, that's probably likely to be more persistent. So younger voters tend to be today's younger voters tend to be more democratic. They'll probably continue that bubble as they grow. There's often the saying you'll hear like, oh, young people are liberal and older people are conservative. That's not a ton of evidence for that. And people actually tend to stick with where, once they're sort of in their 20s and figure out who they are politically, they tend to carry that with them. I mean, there's a little bit of drift, but they tend to carry that with them throughout the rest of their adulthood. So today's sort of millennial voters are leaning Democratic. White male millennial voters a little bit less so, but as a whole, millennial voters are leaning Democratic. They'll probably continue to be so as they work their way through the election system. Through our coming election cycles. So the age thing I think will hold. The gender / college education / suburban thing, that one I don't know, and I'm really curious about it because I do wonder how much that's tied to sort of the political moment right now. It's a great question, though. Yes, sir.
You're an LSU medalist, PhD. You're an arm of LSU. So you're our flagship university, and you're speaking today, I guess, to the people of Louisiana. Sociologists have a way to ask questions to know what your motivation is, cross questions are. Do you ever ask questions to beyond just who you're going to vote for and how you're going to vote, that would say, what is full funding for our universities and where are we now, so that you know from the populace what they think?
Right, so the question is, do we ask sort of these detailed questions on topics like higher education? What would full funding for higher education look like? How does that relate to what we have now? So this poll is a national poll, and we're not getting into that level of policy specifics in this poll. Now, as many of you may know, one of the other projects the Manship School is involved with is our annual Louisiana survey, which is focused strictly on Louisiana. We do that in the spring. We do get more we actually don't do anything related to elections specifically in terms of votes. In that poll, we focus strictly on policy, the mood in the state, what people think about different policies. We occasionally get into very specific questions. I don't recall, at least not in my tenure, where we've asked people like what would sufficient funding for higher education look like? But in the past, we have asked highly specific questions, such as things related to the sales tax rate. Do they know how much of the sales tax in Louisiana is the state sales tax? What would be the right state sales tax rate versus the local sales tax rate? We don't. So I think there's a difference between getting into depth and getting into the weeds on policy. And I find the latter is often, polling is not often a super useful tool for it, because a lot of people don't follow policy that closely. And so once you get into sort of this level of hyper-specific, you're not going to get a lot of quality response. You're going to get a lot of people being, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never thought about it before. But that's sort of the reality that we live in. We, as a state, and every state does, we have to make policy decisions, right? And that requires being specific if we're going to pass laws or budgets. And we want to know in a democracy or a republic what the public thinks, but the public doesn't think in that level of specifics. And so that really, I think, is more of a challenge of leadership to figure out how do we translate the more general leanings of what it is a public wants into policies and laws that somehow follow that when you have to come and figure out what the nuts and bolts are. Yes, sir.
Can you give us an example of how you know when you've done enough polling that the poll is representative?
Great. So the question is, how do you know the poll's representative? How do you know when you've done enough? So that's actually sort of two separate issues. In terms of knowing that you have enough, that's based on how precise you want to be, and that's basically a guess because it depends on how close the responses are. So if I want to have a margin of error of 4 points, then I know I've got to try to go out and get something like 1,000 to 1,200 respondents. So that's sort of how I get to the number of the sample based on how precise I want to be in terms of my claims. I know that 56% of people think this, give or take 4 points. If I want it to be give or take 4 points, I got to go get 1,000 to 1,200 people. If I'm fine for it being give or take 6 points, well, then I can go get 500 people. So that's how you get to the size. So the size really doesn't have anything to do with representativeness once you're sort of above like 100, right? If you're only going to talk to 5 people, it's going to be an issue. Representativeness really comes down to how you do the poll. What mode do you use? How do you select the sample? Is it a probability that is a random sample? And then what kind of statistical weighting do you do on the back end to ensure that, oh, look, I might have my sample has more women than the population, so I've got to make some statistical adjustments to make it representative. That's all polls need to do that, because a random sample, by randomness, is not going to be exactly representative. So you need some statistical tools at the back end to help it be representative. But it's really the method in terms of sampling and weighting that gets you to representation. The size and how many, that has to do with precision.
Let's take the example of Louisiana governor. How do you get to decide you have a representation of the population of Louisiana? And each of the districts is represented in the poll, that they're not all out of New Orleans or Shreveport or Baton Rouge. What's your mechanism?
So you do that through your sampling, right? So you're going to do it. So first of all, even if you just did a straight probability sample of the state, you're going to get the share of people, assuming that response rates aren't crazy different in different parts of the state, and they actually are a little bit different. They tend to be lower in New Orleans, actually, rather than higher. Then you're going to end up getting roughly shares of people in rural populations that are similar to the share in the state population as a whole. But what you can do to sort of try to ensure that is you just do what we call stratified sampling, to say, like, rather than draw a sample of 2,000 respondents from Louisiana, I'm going to break out I know that 60% of Louisiana fall, or 20% of Louisiana falls in these parishes, 30% falls in these parishes, whatever percent falls in these parishes. So I'm going to draw random samples within each of those, but only to the size that they will then contribute 20% to the total, because they're only 20% of the population. And so that's how you ensure you have coverage within those subgroups.
Okay, let's think